All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the October edition of the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center webinar. We're very excited to have you with us this month. We are welcoming Jacyln Robidoux from Maine Sea Grant and Liz MacDonald from Atlantic Sea Farms today. And they have recently been on a very exciting trip with a couple of other folks from the state of Maine to visit the Japanese seaweed industry. And they've been learning lots about tech transfer and how the industry there is structured. So we wanted to have them on the call today to tell us all about that. I am personally very interested, so this is going to be amazing. And I'm super excited. If you have questions throughout this webinar, we are taking questions, so feel free to just drop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will ask some of the questions throughout and some of the questions at the end, depending on what questions they are. So make sure to utilize that. This will be the most fun if people are super engaged. So with that, I will give the floor to our lovely presenters and they can have the hour. So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Maya. I'm going to share my screen, and in the meantime, how about Liz and I introduce ourselves? Okay, cool. You should be able to see this now, and you should be able to hear us talking as well. All right, sweet. Liz, you want to kick it off?
Let's do it. Hi, I'm Liz MacDonald, and I'm from Atlantic Sea Farms. I work with our amazing network of partner farmers.
And I'm Jacyln Robidoux from Maine Sea Grant. I am our seaweed-focused extension agent. And so I work with farmers, processors, researchers, you name it, all over the coast. And for the next hour, we are going to take a trip to Japan. And this is something that Liz and I were saying we could talk about this for hours at length. So we're going to try and keep it to 40 minutes and hopefully leave some time for questions. So as we go through, think of your questions. We're super excited to share about this. It was an amazing trip. So a bit of an overview about what we'll talk about. We'll kind of cover a little bit of the background and current status of kelp cultivation that we learned about while we were in Japan. We'll review some of the farming and drying processes, including some of the cool equipment we got to check out. And then we'll also talk about some of the value-added manufacturing and products, as well as lessons learned. So that's what we're in for the next 40 or so minutes.
And our trip was wonderfully funded by the Builders Initiative, and it was organized by Coastal Maine Enterprises. This lovely photo that we have here is the group that we were with for the 5 days that we were in Japan in June earlier this year. And so we had delegates from wild harvest industry from Maine Coast Sea Vegetables in Maine, as well as farmed with Atlantic Sea Farms. 3 of our partner farmers came along. We had Leah from Barnacle Seafoods representing Alaska seaweed, as well as research from Woods Hole with Scott Lindell, and our 2 wonderful translators, hosts in Japan, one who actually lives in Maine. So we had a great time with this group of people. And Hugh, who organized our whole trip from Coastal Enterprises and made the whole thing happen. So thanks, Hugh, thanks, Builders, and yeah, this was our trip.
It was an awesome group and a lot of Mainers, so it's pretty cool.
It was fun. Giving a general overview of seaweed that is coming from Japan, we really saw a small subsect of what's happening in the country. So giving you a representation here that we saw Saccharina primarily, Saccharina japonica, and this we'll go through and talk about more in the words of kombu as we're going through this presentation. So there was a lot more that's happening in the country that we didn't see, but we're going to speak to this 8% here.
So when it came to kind of learning the landscape, we spent the first day meeting with researchers at the Hokkaido Fisheries Research Institute, who kind of gave us an overview of kelp farming. And then we also got a chance to meet with the Hokkaido Seafood Inspection Association, which is the organization that's actually responsible for setting the grading and standards for kelp farming in all of Hokkaido, and then folks from the Hakodate Fishing Cooperative who do nursery production, manage the resource, and also buy back the kelp. So it was a jam-packed first day, kind of getting a lay of the land there. Some of the things that we heard about was that, as kelp culture has kind of been consistent, the wild kelp landings have kind of been gradually declining. So the folks from the Hakodate Fisheries Research Institute kind of took us through this. You can see here one of the researchers explaining a little bit of the temperature and time, or I guess the time trends in the season and some of the climate related delays that they're seeing. So on top, you can kind of see the wild kelp abundance, and then you can see that he's highlighting that there's been a delay in the start of aquaculture. So kind of interesting to see the climate related impacts there.
This is building off of what Jacyln was just talking about. There's a little bit more information that we got by region, going up into the Hokkaido area. And so the main thing is that, aquaculture, farmed kelp has been pretty consistent since 2003, and that industry hasn't been growing. So there's a big difference there from what we're seeing here in the US and how that industry is really growing, especially in Maine. And the similarities in decline in the wild populations due to climate change and other factors that are influencing the environment. We also were able to talk with researchers at Hokkaido University, and they got a little bit more into the actual different strains within a single species and the research that they have been doing to understand how those populations generally differ by region in just the northern area of Japan that we were in. And we found this pretty fascinating of, looking at the picture on the left versus the right and what had been previously known. And after this scientific investigation, what was actually found to be true on the right. So genetic structure analysis is really important and is like a cornerstone of having a thriving, resilient aquaculture industry. So we thought that was very significant.
And I think this is a good opportunity here too to see the island itself. So you can kind of see Hokkaido where we were, and we visited a few different sites throughout the island. And another thing with all of these variations is they had a lot of different common names as well. So same species, but depending upon where the kelp was grown, we heard lots of different common names, which at times was a little hard to keep track of, but was really cool because it actually has to do with the variants themselves. Okay, so a little bit about kelp farming.
We'll try our best to keep with all the different variants as we go through, but yeah, that was a complicated part with translation, especially, and learning the lay of the land. But this was when things got really exciting on our second day of the trip when we got to visit our first farm. And so giving you a little bit more lay of the land here, we were on the northeastern area of Hokkaido, and we got to visit what was a fishing cooperative. And so the structure of how the farming is done in Japan is mostly through cooperatives. So there's large groups. In some areas, they range from 100 to 200 people within a cooperative. And this is building off of other fisheries there. So primarily the squid fishery, they have co-ops, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through today too. But we were really lucky to get to see this established co-op and had actually the director of the co-op take us out. So in the next photo or the next slide, the expanse of the farms was amazing to take in. It was being able to see kind of the surface profile of farms as far as the eye could see, very near to shore as well. So similarly how our farms are relatively close to shore in Maine, that was a common similarity, but the scale here is on a much larger footprint. The individual plots that farmers manage was pretty similar in size. They're just very, very more, like so many more of them all in the same space, but looking across very similar surface profile, seeing buoys, and a lot of small family boats that weren't very large vessels working these farm operations.
Yeah, and even in this picture, you can see a few other folks out there working on the horizon, which is pretty cool. Some videos that I hope work, but just to give you guys an idea of what it was like to be on the water out there. Like Liz mentioned, the expanse of farms was just incredible to see. So, you know, just very different visually. I think a lot of jaws dropped when we came out of the little mountain pass and got to the coast in this region.
I have a question that I came up with just now. Sorry
Yeah,
to interrupt.
too, Maya.
With the co-op structure, I was wondering how much sharing of vessels happens or sharing of harvest equipment versus people owning their own, just based off of what you were saying with families having small boats and stuff.
So one of the things that I found really interesting was some of the initial farm gear was owned by the co-op. So the anchors, which is a big one, the anchors and the initial infrastructure to build the farms, the co-op invests in and provides to the farmers. Over time, if you need to replace gear or update equipment, that's on the farmers then to upgrade from that initial infrastructure investment that the co-op makes. The other thing I found really interesting was that, so here, you know, you apply for a lease or a permit, you get those from the state, and that's your area as long as you maintain those leases and licenses. In the co-op, there's a lottery system. So after a certain amount of time, there is a lottery for which plot you actually get within the overarching space that the co-op manages. So that was a very different component, but the ropes, the farmers manage themselves, the buoys, they manage themselves. The vessels, to the best of my understanding, the farmers, the individual family farmers maintain those themselves also. And sometimes there's shared resources between people that have other fishery involvement in their family. So like if they have someone that works on the squid, sometimes there's a sharing of gear with the boats and vessels too, which felt similar. I don't know if you want to add anything, Jacyln, there.
No, that was great.
Cool.
Sweet. Okay, so some kelp coming out of the water. Another jaw-dropping moment for everyone, just because the size of this variety or this species of kelp is enormous. It's really thick, it's really broad. So it was just beautiful. I think we were all wowed by that. You can see there's the holdfasts themselves are in these giant balls, and each ball contains only about 4 or 5 blades. So the line has been kind of trimmed throughout. You can kind of see that in that initial photo there.
And so going back to that holdfast bundle, I mean, you can see there's a lot of weight here with the kelp and the growth. And so the farmers actually go in mid-season and they add support ties to those holdfasts to make sure that they stay on the lines. And that way they're also not moving across the lines too and interfering with other bundles. The anchors that I was talking about earlier, in a lot of these farms, because they're in shallow water and close to shore, this in particular, this farm, they use sandbags, and that blew my mind. That was like one of the sticking points. So a really low cost investment and easy to maneuver, easy to handle. The ropes as well that they're growing on, Jacyln has a great picture, next slide, but they're very rigid, and there's actually a small piece of that twine, that cultivation twine that's inoculated, that's in the lay of the line, and that's where those bundles are actually coming from. So they're not seeding in the traditional method that we do in Maine or in the US, where they're covering the whole grow line with inoculated seed twine. And that was really fascinating for us to learn as well.
Mm-hmm. And in this photo on the right, you can see down in that right-hand corner, just the number of blades that are coming out of each of those areas is really limited to focus on getting the most growth and the highest quality out of each individual blade. This is that photo that Liz just referenced, and so you can kind of see the cultivation line in yellow, and then an additional line through it, and then one more snippet, that like lightest twine is the seed line. So a very different seeding method where they're inserting it into the line. This is harvesting the kelp on another farm in Isan, and so you can see just kind of the setup, the size of the boat. We learned a lot of these farms are either family operations or operated by crews of anywhere between 2 to 5 people, I would say. So not, these are not giant operations, and they're harvesting right into the vessel itself there.
I have another question. This is how this one's going to go, I think.
I love it.
Yeah.
So did you have a conversation with the folks who were seeding the lines to understand how that process works and if it's more labor intensive and how long it might take to do it that way?
Go for it, Jacyln. You got that
one. We got a chance to talk to some of the nursery operators. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the co-ops run the nurseries. So that's kind of the relationship there. I didn't, Liz, you might have a better answer on this one, but I believe it's the co-ops who are providing that twine and then the farmers who are inserting it into the line and getting it onto the farm.
That's how I understood it as well. And they didn't have any machinery that automated putting those tiny pieces of twine into the line. That was all hand done. And that was mostly done by the families as well, because we're going to talk a little bit more about the production of the kelp once it comes off and how the families are really involved there. But similarly, on the beginning side of outplanting, it's a family operation, 3 to 5 people, and they do all of that inserting by hand. And that's really different than other places in Asia like Korea, where they have machinery that's automated to do that. So we found that pretty interesting. And the nurseries, actually from the co-op, they produce a lot less feet or miles of seed string than we do here because they're only doing those small inserts. So that was pretty informative as well. Just the nurseries are seasonal. They only have a small amount of workers that work there, and they don't produce a huge range of miles of seed twine.
Right. I think that the family operation aspect is just so cool. And I know Liz is going to talk about it here, but it was just amazing to see the generational, like multiple generations involved in the same seaweed business. It was amazing.
And this farm that we got to see in particular, Mr. Sawaguchi was a 5th generation seaweed farmer. And, that's not even something that exists here in our country. So being able to talk with someone that had generational knowledge there, it felt very similar to our traditional fisheries here. And that was a very, I know, inspiring correlation for our farmers as well that were on the trip. And Mr. Sawaguchi was only 27 years old and had been running this farm since he was 16 and was taught basically everything from his grandfather, who we also got to meet at their house, who is still part of the operation. So that was, speaking back to Jacyln, like there's something about that aspect that was really pivotal here. And going back to the farming, so these small boats, this was at most a 35-foot vessel. And what you see in the top left-hand corner where the boat was empty was, pre-harvest. And they had these wooden sections in the boat that they used to harvest the kelp. There's no automation either here where they're harvesting. They're doing that by hand. I thought it was important to note that the counterweights that they're using were rocks with holes in them. We're talking really simplistic structures on the farm here that do a lot of great work and that no one has changed for a long period of time. Once those boats are filled with kelp, and we have some great videos to see that happening, they're actually harvested into bundles. So that way they're really easy to manage when they come off of the farm. And those bundles that you're seeing are blades that are being cut on the farm at the time of harvest. That's maybe only 1/3 the length of the entire blade that was growing on the farm. So we're getting that key quality section of kelp here. And that is really important when we get into the processing side of things and how it fits with the machinery and the handling. but those blades, those bundles of blades are then offloaded by that crane truck that you see. Basically, every farmer has a boat, they have a crane truck, and they have an at-home processing facility. So it was really interesting to see. And they actually do a lot of wet storage. And so they'll hold the product right on those small vessels in those metal hooks that you see. So it's kind of hard to see in the photo, but there is a like a couple lines. Yeah, thank you for the cursor. Those are the lines that you're seeing up in the air in the photo on the left. And when the farmers are ready and have the space to process them, they'll offload from their boat with their crane truck and drive it less than 5-10 minutes to their at-home processing facility.
Yeah, that boat crane truck at home processing facility was really consistent across the board. And I think another thing to point out here is you'll see this kind of, it's a bell shape almost of the kelp that's coming out of the water. And about, I mean, a huge amount of biomass was cut off, just the very end. I mean, not just the very ends, actually probably half to 2/3 of the way down, and just let sink to the bottom of the farm because it wouldn't have met some of the quality standards. So you can kind of see it in this video, the kelp getting those bundles coming off, being loaded in. Obviously, it's pretty weighty. And in this picture, you can really see how long those individual blades actually are, upwards of 30 feet, and anything from, probably the middle of this blade would not be considered food quality and is just cut off and isn't stored or processed at all. And I found this part cool. That is feed for the urchins that then live underneath the farms, and the urchin fishery depends on it. So it's kind of neat.
Once they take the kelp from the dock, put it in their crane truck, they drive it home. Most of that kelp gets dried, and that's where a lot of the product that we saw on this trip was in the dried format. And so people have a lot of at-home processing, and it's pretty simple in the way that it's hand-hung. They have specialized clips that have really strong teeth to them. They're not just like your straight-up clothespins. They're very specialized. And once all the kelp is hung, they just use a series of fans from above and on the floor in order to aerate the space and get equal flow throughout the room. It was also probably the hottest place I've ever been in my entire life. The humidity and the heat, and we were there in June, so it was doing its job. It was really warm. And yeah, I think we have some videos of this also.
And I think it's an understatement to say that some of us were obsessed with these clips. I believe some were sent home just because of how functional they were. And so I think that we have some videos of inside, but I'll let Liz explain what's going on here too.
Once the kelp was dried to the ratio that they wanted, and I think going back to that generational knowledge, they could feel the kelp touch it and be like, okay, it's the ratio of dryness that we want. There's the water content here that we want. I know by the feel and the look of the kelp that this is adequate to go to the next stage of processing. So that was really interesting too. Kind of like how some of our fishermen here in Maine can feel a lobster. They're like, oh, hard shell, soft shell, done. Don't even have to, it was very similar in that muscle memory. And once the kelp is dried, then the family aspect comes back into play here, and that processing is done all by hand as well. They're taking the kelp off of the drying racks, they're sorting it, and then they're cutting it. They're cutting it to a specific length so that way it fits into the packaging that they're ultimately going to send back to the co-op. Once the kelp is cut, it's bundled by hand. Those bundles are then this is where there's some first automation happening. They're put into this press essentially, which is a very basic piece of machinery, but has a really important function here and works just seamlessly with the operation. So all of this is still at Mr. Sawaguchi's house on his property where he lives. So it's packaged, and that bottom photo that you see, all that kelp, once it's squeezed into the press, is packaged inside that box. So they're able to fit a lot of kelp into a small package. And that package actually contains, on the front, that writing has his name, his co-op name. So there's traceability there in where the product came from. And the color of the ribbon, that green color, is really important and signifies the quality and grade of the kelp that is being sent to the co-op for sale. So there are over 100 different grades that we were kind of shown on a sheet of grading, and that was really impressive. And I think a lot of the whole group that was there, the farmers, I mean, we were all really like blown away by that standard. And different bands, different colors, the amount of bands, all of that was a communication tool to the co-op to say what kind of quality the kelp was, where it came from, and then how they were going to sell it wholesale next. So that is another part of the co-op. So the farmers get the seed from them, they get that initial infrastructure for the farm, and then they sell the kelp back to the co-op, who then sells it wholesale out to retailers, ingredient sales, wherever its next sale point is.
Mm-hmm. This is a video from inside the kelp dryer. What you don't feel is the overwhelming heat and like steam, but it was really cool, and you can kind of see, and this is all happening in the course of one day. So the beginning of the day, that kelp is offloaded into the crane truck, and by the end of the day, it is packaged in that color-coded box that was just on the last screen. So it's pretty cool to see it go from in the water to completely graded and sorted and packaged. Just a couple more videos. You can see these are the boxes. They fill those up to the top, and that's the size of one bundle, which will then be compressed down. And this was kind of the processing area. I have to point out in the back, they had these cool flags, and those are actually like family flags, signifying like what they're fishing for. I just thought that was so neat that in addition to being shade and coverage, they also had some significance, which I think is kind of true for so many parts of this, even the grading, or, you know, nothing is just there randomly. Everything is really intentional, I think, when it comes to their like kelp space. And so you can see here the process of actually getting that grading band on. So the kelp press has flattened it, and the gentleman here is kind of looping that wrap through to keep it all nice and tight. I had to include this because this was so fun. So much of what we learned or got to experience, we ended up having a lot of like video to video exchanges. So this is a video of a kelp farmer showing us his camera roll, or we had kelp farmers who showed us their Instagrams. So it was kind of neat as a visual tool to exchange things that we weren't able to see or weren't there for. They were able to kind of show us. And I wanted to highlight here too, this is just driving the Japanese coastline in Hokkaido, and it looks a lot different than the Maine coast. Each of these buildings is what we were talking about before. So if it goes back to the beginning, I want to just pause it because we're going to see a lot of kelp drying facilities. There's one there. There's another one there. There's another one there. So, you know, the coast is just made up of farmers' homes and their drying facilities. And it's really cool to be able to be in that space within close proximity to where the farm is, which is right out there. And in between these houses, you can kind of see some of the boats out there working.
The co-ops additionally are there also to enforce quality, and we met with a group of individuals that were not associated with a co-op but had their own association that was all about quality control and maintaining basically the safe handling and food safety standards. So that was really interesting. And when we were able to visit one of like the fishing co-op like marine supply stores, which was that was a fun adventure. They had these posters all up inside and outside the space, and looking at the translation, I mean, it's really similar to what we see here in our Maine coastline of like, okay, you don't want the seed string to end up in that final product. You don't want rocks. They had insects, you know, sometimes we have snails. Like foreign material was a really important component to making sure that they were having a food safe product, and there was documentation and flyers for that in a lot of different areas that the fishermen and the farmers were frequently in the space of. And then the co-op actually provided a study, and they looked at, okay, what are the highest foreign materials and objects that we're seeing? What are the issues across the board? And yeah, really rocks and that blue material, which is like a tarp that they use, you know, to cover the beds of their trucks or to move product around in a having a food safe coverage, you know, which we could relate back to, okay, some of the bags and handling pieces of equipment that we use here, you know, that happens everywhere. So being alert for that, looking for it, and making sure that people are aware of what the problems are so that way they can fix them and implement new things was definitely apparent and key to this part. Yeah. Okay, outside of the drying, we saw a small percent of other types of production methods. So this was also at Mr. Sawaguchi's. He had a kelp washer. And this was very different than how, you know, we in our processing area think of kelp washing, because this machine actually washed an individual blade at a time. And so when we were talking earlier about how the kelp is cut to be a certain size and a certain length, uniformity is key here to using this machinery and having an efficient process. So they do one blade at a time when they use that washer. So a little tedious, but it seemed to be a really important step. And those green rollers that you can see in the back in the picture all the way on the left, those were really firm, thick bristles. They actually reminded me like very much of debissers in muscle machinery that we have here in the US and other places. So there were some similarities there with other seafood processing, but very firm. And those were to wash off things like bryozoans and any kind of other surface level materials. Blanching seemed very similar, but more small batch blanching. And then shredding as well, a very thin shredder, but that was also made for the size of the blades and that consistency there. So we did see some other processing. And then back to drying, which was the primary processing method here. There is also a lot of just open air outside pebble drying. And this was most common in the wild harvest for the seaweeds that we saw. And these were actually really large areas as well, right along the coastline. So going back to, you know, the communities being able to have shoreside infrastructure access to be doing this primary processing, and the size of the pebbles was really important here to making sure that the kelp was able to come off of the ground without sticking to anything. So that was intentional. The uniformity of the pebbles was intentional. And then you can see the ropes that are just going across were basically to keep the kelp from flying away once it was all dried. And this process didn't take, I think, more than 48 hours, if I remember how they were talking. It was a very short time frame. I mean, the climate there is very similar to ours, but very warm, very humid, fast drying. And this product was actually considered the wild harvested, air dried product was one of the highest quality products that you could find in Japan. And so was highly esteemed.
Mm-hmm. And on the timeline of this drying, another thing that I took away here was they have a certain time that they will let it sit out until, so it kind of gets dry in the sun all day. And then, you know, evening starts to set in and it slacks a little bit, and they know the exact time. Same thing Liz was describing, that like touch, that feel. They know the exact time where it's slacked just enough to be market ready. So it's not bone dry. Which I thought was kind of interesting because we'll see that with some of our wild harvested material here.
And then this was probably the most industrial piece of equipment that we saw for drying components. And this isn't really even a dryer the way I think in North America we're thinking of kelp dryers, where you're putting actual kelp material into a machine and it comes out dry on the other side. This is more of an industrial fan, and that section right almost where the cursor is on the screen right now, where you can see those vents, that is pushing warm, hot air out at a fast volume. And this is a unit that farmers would put actually in their at-home hang drying spaces that we talked about earlier. So it's an addition to their space where they're already hang drying things by hand. But we were able to go to the Terashima company, and they manufactured basically all different kinds of components for kelp processing. And they're one of the largest equipment manufacturers in the country. So it was pretty interesting to be able to talk with them and see the products that they made. They also made the kelp washer that I talked about a couple of slides ago. So they had a wide range of products here.
And kind of speaking to that, you can see in these different colors, there's kind of this orange one, there's a green one, there's this blue one. They made the dryers at different sizes as well. So we got a chance to talk with them about how you would outfit a space, what size dryer you might need for what size space or capacity. And again, the color coding there is really satisfying for those who love a color code.
And then we also got to see value add manufacturing. So once the kelp leaves the co-op and it's going into its, okay, what products is this going to go into? There were a lot of those companies as well, and they were very well established. And we saw one in particular that had multiple different product streams. And yeah, we have some great videos of that, but this was a really important part to actually like, how does that kelp get to market? What are people buying, and what products that they're using in an everyday capacity to integrate that kelp into their everyday diet and life?
This is a video of that line there. Sorry, a little loud. But you can see it's filling up these bottles with dashi concentrate. And so for folks who've never heard of dashi, it's created from kelp and traditionally bonito flakes. So it's kind of like a liquid that goes into soup stock. It's one of the main ingredients in miso soup, and it is in so many parts of Japanese cooking. And so this is a company that is making and kind of like value added concentrate that at-home cooks can use just a scoop of, as opposed to having to make their own. So it was pretty neat to see the final stage of this kelp, and just a sample of all of the different products that they make. So a bunch of different dashi products, different kinds, different blends. So it's pretty cool. And I have this in here because this is what a lot of the experience looked like, just a shout out to Kay and our translators who were so helpful in understanding all of the complex stuff that's going on the whiteboard there. Another example of a value-added product we saw was some farmer innovation. And so this is back at Mr. Sawaguchi's site. You can see on the left here, it's a package of kelp, and they have 3 farmers. That is actually meant to be the 3 farmers that you saw harvesting in the earlier videos. And what it is a blanched or a cut and blanched, then dried kelp noodle salad kind of thing. And so it's packaged in those. What it looks like when it's rehydrated, it's these lovely noodles, really light flavor. We got a chance to try them with just a little bit of soy sauce on top and a little bit of dashi. So it was really great. But learning more about how farmers themselves are interested in creating new products or doing something a little bit different to meet new consumer preferences. We also got to go to the direct sales store for this fisheries cooperative. So they had all products made from the kelp that was farmed from the cooperative. It was so cool. We bought a lot of stuff. But just an example of the type of products, everything from noodles to sauces to teas to soap. It was really very incredible to see.
And everything was labeled in a way that, kind of going back to that earlier slide where there were different regions, the different strains. So that labeling came into play here, even with the products on the shelf. So when you're looking, you can know, okay, by the name, what the quality is, how it was handled, what region it was from. And that was really interesting from like a traceability, marketing standpoint of what is important to consumers here and what they're looking for in the packaging to want to buy the products outside of what the products do and in the quality of how they taste and things like that. So there was a huge range, and I think most of us stuffed a lot of products into our suitcases coming home after seeing the stores.
I would be lying if I didn't say that I bought another suitcase just to bring home kelp stuff. Just a couple lessons learned, and some of them we've highlighted throughout. But just some things that came to mind to kind of wrap this up were just the simple time-tested growing methods that farms were using. So they're really not overbuilt, and they're manageable by small crews. This whole sector really supported these small family operators. So farmers throughout the process were growing their own, processing their own, doing some of their own value-added innovation. And then the majority of the kelp was consolidated through the co-op, which was the major buyer. The alignment with other fisheries felt very Maine-like in the sense where, the integration with working waterfronts. So that was similar, but the coastline, was dramatically different. Farmers are living and working on the water there, and there was the coastline is really set up to support working waterfronts. So every, couple minutes you'd pass another fortified area where farmers would be working out of. Looks a lot different than the Maine coast. And then another thing that was really different was the regulatory environment. So everything from permitting, which they're not permitting in the same way. They're going through the fisheries co-op, like Liz mentioned, to food safety, like, FDA regulations was something that I think everyone was like, wow, this would be hard to just lift this model and put it here because of some of the regulations that we have. So in some ways that was a little difficult to compare, but really useful to see and learn. And then on the product side, product quality was a huge focus. And this is across the board, everything from the blades, the farms, crop thinning, grading standards, nothing was half-assed. Everything was absolutely like top-notch. And then almost all of the product is dried first when it comes to the products that are being made. We do see it being rehydrated. So at that dashi facility, you could see it was being rehydrated and used in other products, but a lot of the products are starting off dried. Something that was similar to Maine, I thought, was the growing emphasis on value-added products. The folks at the facility producing the dashi concentrate were talking about how young Japanese people are not wanting to make their own dashi. They're wanting to have the concentrate so it's ready to go and easy to use, which sounded very similar to some of the things that we hear here. And then finally, this one's not product related, but just something that we got to learn about from the research community there are the similar climate issues. So changes to natural beds, impact on harvest timing. And so really highlighting that shared need for climate resilience in the sector moving forward. We have to share a few of the amazing food photos because what's a trip to Japan without pictures of the food? And seaweed and dashi and kelp was in all of these. So we got some amazing meals, including in the center, a Japanese breakfast, which was so cool. And I think about it all the time. And the star of the show, kelp ice cream. So with that, just a huge thank you to our trip organizers, Hugh, CEI, the Builders Initiative, Kay, our translator, Naoto, all of the local hosts and institutions. Everyone was so generous, and it was a really great crew to travel to the other side of the world with and then get to bring some of those lessons home. So that was our trip, and it was so amazing. Liz, I don't know if you have anything to add too.
You wrapped it up wonderfully. Thank you. I think one of the things I'm just realizing we might not have mentioned was they actually, on the farming side, the outplant and harvest were similar time frame too. So we have a lot of similarities there, but their harvests, they do a lot of small harvests for a lot longer period of time. But outside of that, the entire experience was wonderful, completely educational, and we learned so much. And yeah, happy to share more with anyone that has any specific questions after this. Anyone that watches the recording later, feel free to reach out to us. Happy to share more, and I would encourage anyone that's interested in traveling to Japan to do it. It was a beautiful country. People were extremely welcoming, easy to travel and navigate, and yeah, just overall wonderful.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I do have a question from an attendee, and I would encourage all of the other folks attending to put in questions because otherwise you're going to get to listen to me for the next 14 minutes, ask every question that I have. So that's, your fate is in your hands. It's up to you. But the first audience question that we have is about social license and wondering about the landscape of social license in Japan, since a lot of people in Maine are in Maine and other parts of the country are working with coastal landowners who have a lot of input on these issues, and they're wondering what that was like in Japan, if it was the case at all.
Well, I'll go back to earlier. We only saw, less than 10% representative for the entire country. And Japan, even though is in comparison to the US, a smaller country in size, I mean, the production there is so much higher. And has been going on for so much longer than here. And it is integrated into the culture there in the family organization of the co-ops, which happens on other islands outside of the northern island that we were on, down even in Okinawa in the southern region of the country. So I think the importance of it as a food staple, as something that people have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, integrated in every meal there, really aids to the farmers in their area being able to have the ability to do this heritage fishery there. And I mean, I don't think I'm trying to remember some of the discussions that we had there, the gentrification piece really in the Northern Island, region that we were in wasn't coming into play in the way that we're experiencing that here in Maine. Those communities were farmer focused. Basically, the people that lived there, that's what they did. Hokkaido was a huge island for agriculture. So that ice cream even that we talked about at the end, they have a huge dairy industry in that region, corn, rice. So farming was a really key component of the livelihoods there, even outside of just seaweed farming. And I think that contributed a lot to the success of just that agriculture farming industry in that region. Jacyln, feel free to add any other points there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you highlighted it with the generational aspect of like kind of that generational knowledge and that and the presence of the fisheries cooperatives as a major steward of the coastline in the regions that we were in. We did not hear a ton about difficulties with social license. We heard a lot more about the generational fishing communities.
Awesome. Thank you for elaborating on that. It sounds somewhat, I mean, I know you've made a lot of comparisons throughout to some of Maine's like historic fishing industries and stuff, but it sounds like culturally they have identified with kelp farming in a similar way that Maine has identified with a lot of fishing. So, okay, I'm again going to encourage folks to drop questions in the chat, but until people start doing that, I'm going to start asking you my questions, which I've been writing down. So my first question was about the different kelp grades. So you said that there were over 100 different grades of kelp, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what some of the visual differences were between those and what the uses were, and how that might transfer to Maine, if anyone ever got that deep into grading kelp here.
One difference that comes to mind, and this is so subtle that I wouldn't have noticed it in a photo. I barely noticed it in real life. Was folks saying like, "Oh, this is black kelp and this is white kelp. And I'm looking at these bundles of kelp and they look the same, like identical. And what they were talking about is the area where you are cutting, where the kelp is cut, is that margin retaining the dark, like almost black green color, or is it turning a white? Like these are the subtle differences. I mean, I could show a photo and you'd be like, those bundles are the same kind of kelp, but in their grading system, they're not.
I see, even going back to the water content that Jacyln was talking about when the wild harvest air drying, things that had a little bit higher moisture content that had been out in that nightly dew a little bit longer. I mean, that was even considered a different grade, a different quality. And so those subtle differences were extremely apparent in that grading scheme. But I'd say like, us coming from being like such a young industry was really hard to recognize with the naked eye and without having that training. Yeah.
And even in the beginning, when we, some of our earliest presentations from the folks at the group that does all the standards and grading, they gave us a diagram of a kelp blade, and the diagram of the kelp blade had like dashed lines all throughout it. So like dashed lines that cut off the sides and dashed lines that cut off the holdfast and dashed lines that cut off the end. It was divided up like you would see a diagram of a cow or a pig, where there's actually different parts that have different value, different names. So that was pretty cool to just see like within one kelp blade, all of the different parts, and they each have different uses, and are not considered, it's not just like a blade of sugar kelp is a blade of sugar kelp. It was very, very precise.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. How can you remind me before I ask the next audience question, how long some of these blades were getting and how fast that meant they were growing?
Yeah, some of them were like 30 feet long, and that was a general average. So there were definitely ones that were longer than that. They were essentially the size of the boat before they were cut for that quality section that the farmers were going for. And so that like culling component for farming was like, oh, no harm, no foul. Like, sure, cut it off, get rid of it. Like, we only want the best of the best. And that was apparent on both the farms we went to. Yeah, and the outplant time was really similar to ours in the fall because they have a similar season, similar environment to us. And so I think they said November was still the ideal outplant time frame. And the harvest, though, was the different part where they would do small harvests every day from, I think, starting as early as March, but going throughout late June. So elongated harvest, which was different.
And that the method for cutting the bottom off of that kelp was a blade attached to a very long stick and just basically like hacking at the ball of kelp and releasing almost the entire bottom half. So that kind of illustrates the amount of kelp that is not considered to be that like high quality standard. But yeah, the blade length was mind-blowing to us here. I think we all saw that kelp come out of the water and had a little kelp envy.
Mm-hmm. Being a totally different, species, being a kelp, but not being like our sugar kelp, not something that's native here. So we definitely had to like remind ourselves of that. Okay, there are some like species differences here for that growth, and also the longevity of that as a fishery in Japan, how much time and investment has gone into getting the right strains to grow, and that being managed by the co-ops. And that tool that Jacyln was just talking about to cut the kelp, I found it fascinating that it was just a stick with a blade at the end, but the stick was a certain size, and that was like a standard across all the boats, all the farmers. And that size stick was like, okay, that's how long my kelp should be after I cut it. So it was like a tool to cut, but also a tool for a unit of measurement that was like a stick that was just a certain length. And that's all it had to be to do its like proper function, but do like 2 or 3, key components of that function too.
Wow, that's so intentional.
Yeah.
Um, that's really interesting. Um, One question that just came up kind of to add on to this. So I know you just mentioned that the species are different there and that contributed to the length of the blade, but the audience member is wondering if growing at a lower density was also impacting the like the length of the blade and how it was thriving on the line.
I think it could definitely be a contributing factor. The environment, the nutrient availability of the area, the mixing that's happening, but I wouldn't rule it out as something that would contribute to that.
Yeah, and I think that thinning of those initial clumps, that's not for no reason, right? Like it is to get they're very intentional about getting the blades to the right size and the right length. So I would be willing to bet that has something to do with it, just in terms of how many blades you're growing in an area.
Hmm. Awesome. Um, Another question is wondering about any disease, pests, parasites, or biofouling that the farmers were encountering there.
We heard a little bit about more about biofouling, I would say. Folks talking about just bryozoans, and actually it seemed very similar to the types of biofouling you'd see here. So there's like crusting bryozoans that are on the surface. Um, didn't hear a lot about pests as much. I know here we hear a lot about kelp snails. Didn't hear so much about that. I know there are urchins that are underneath these farms, but they seem to be satisfied with all of the kelp that's being cut off specifically to feed them, and not venturing up higher into the kelp that's meant for food. And then on the pathogen side, I don't really recall too many conversations about that, even with the researchers. So that didn't seem to be a thing that was highlighted all that much.
Hmm.
And I remember us asking too, because we were really interested just with the scale and size. And yeah, it wasn't something that came up as a point of discussion that they were facing or concerned of at the moment.
Yeah, there was much more concern around shifts in natural beds and impacts to the wild harvest sector, due to rising ocean temperatures.
Some of the farmers were actually talking with us about like that green gravel idea and how they could be working actually more in like conservation of, okay, how do we get more um, seed more wild beds? And um, some people were actually like, "Ugh, why did we integrate urchins underneath our farms?" Like we did hear 1 or 2 farmers say that at one point too. So that was interesting.
Yeah, we
Hmm.
had a whole presentation about gel filled with kelp gametophytes and the potential for that to reseed the floor, the ocean floor there.
Great. Um, we have a couple comments just about how grateful people are for this and that they learned a lot. So phenomenal job to both of you. We are at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap things up. But for anyone who's on the call and had further questions, we can reach out to you directly um, to kind of help answer those. And if you reach out to me, I can put you in contact with both of our presenters today so you can learn more about what they gathered from this trip and about how this trip kind of came to be and how it's being applied in Maine and beyond now. So thank you again to Jacyln and Liz. I will give you my real life round of applause. I hope everyone else is applauding you from wherever they are. And just a reminder to stay in tune for our MAIC webinar series that we have monthly on the third Friday of every month. So we'll be back with you in November. And that's what I got for you. Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you guys for putting this all together. It was super fun getting an hour to relive our trip. It was awesome.
Amazing.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.